Get that old man out of here and make him sweep. That was what the engineer said about a 58-year-old bricklayer who had spent 42 years working on construction sites. She humiliated him in front of everyone. Raimundo picked up the broom and said nothing. But as he swept the yard, he already knew about a mistake that could cost the company $40,000, and the engineer who had humiliated him had no idea. Raimundo arrived at the residential complex construction site the same way he arrived everywhere, carrying his lunch in a bag, wearing a faded cap, and keeping a small black notebook in the pocket of his work apron. He was not a man of idle conversation. He was a man of observation. While the other bricklayers chatted during their first days on the job, Raimundo walked slowly around the site. He studied the walls, examined the floors, stopped in corners, tilted his head slightly, and then continued without saying a word. He was 58 years old and had spent 42 of those years on construction sites. He was not fast, but he was precise. And on a construction site, precision is worth more than speed. Every morning and afternoon, Raimundo opened his notebook. He wrote down what the plan said should be done and what was actually being done. Between those two notes, he left a space where he recorded anything that did not match. That space had been growing since his second day on the site. But Raimundo had not said anything yet. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew that a rushed observation was worthless. Before speaking, a person needed to be certain, the certainty of someone who had looked, measured, compared, and slept on a doubt until it became a fact. So Raimundo observed and waited. Engineer Deborah arrived on the third day. She was 33 years old, held a master's degree in structural engineering, and had come from a consulting company in São Paulo. Almeida Construction had hired her to supervise the project's execution. She was competent. That became clear during the first meeting. She knew how to read plans, demanded that deadlines be met, and used the kind of technical vocabulary that commanded attention. Supervisors listened carefully when she spoke, and technicians chose their answers with caution. Deborah's problem was not a lack of knowledge. It was an assumption she carried as though it were a proven fact. Experience without a degree did not matter. A construction site was a place to follow instructions, not to think. And an old bricklayer was an outdated bricklayer. The first time she crossed paths with Raimundo, he was kneeling on the floor and checking the level of a slab with an instrument he had carried since the 1990s. It was simple and analog. It had no battery and no screen. Deborah looked at the instrument, looked at Raimundo, and then turned toward the supervisor. Get that old man out of here and make him sweep. I don't want anyone who can't use precision equipment touching the construction work. Raimundo slowly stood up and brushed the dust from his knees. He looked at the instrument in his hand, the same tool that had helped him prevent structural mistakes on 3 different projects over the previous 20 years, and placed it in his pocket. Then he picked up the broom without saying a word. 3 bricklayers standing nearby looked away. They were not agreeing with Deborah. It was the silent discomfort that appears when people witness an injustice but do not yet know how to confront it. Raimundo swept the yard until the end of the day. That evening, he opened his notebook. He did not write down how he felt. He was not a man who recorded his emotions. Instead, he wrote down what he had noticed on the slab before being sent away. A variation of 2 millimeters. On its own, it meant nothing. Depending on what came next, however, it could mean a great deal. The following morning, Deborah arrived with a new laser level. She showed the supervisor how to use it and never looked at Raimundo. He swept, observed, and took notes. The humiliation became routine. Whenever Raimundo approached a wall to inspect it, Deborah called for the laser-level technician. Whenever he tried to make a comment, she interrupted him with technical terminology before he could finish. It was not because he was wrong. The technical language simply worked like a closed door, but Deborah did not understand that closing a door does not erase what is standing on the other side, and on the other side stood a man who had spent 42 years learning to read what a wall was saying long before it spoke loudly enough for everyone else to hear it. On the morning of the second week, Raimundo stopped in the southern section of the second floor. He examined a wall that was being built, took 5 steps to the left and looked again. Then he returned to his original position, opened his notebook and checked the plan that the supervisor had left folded on top of a brick. He looked at the wall, looked at his notes, and closed the notebook. That evening, He asked the supervisor to prepare 2 specific plans for him to inspect the next day: the plumbing plan and the structural plan for the southern section of the 2nd floor. The supervisor found the request unusual. Bricklayers rarely asked to examine project plans, but he agreed. Raimundo went home, ate dinner, and opened his notebook one last time before going to sleep. He circled one of his notes and wrote 4 words beside it. Then he closed the notebook. The next morning, the 2 plans were waiting for him on a wooden crate. The supervisor had kept his word. He had folded the pages and placed a piece of brick on top to prevent the wind from carrying them away. Raimundo opened both plans carefully and placed them side by side. Then he opened his notebook and compared the plans with the observations he had recorded the night before. For approximately 10 minutes, he said nothing. It was not yet a discovery. It was confirmation that there was something to discover. There was a small difference between what the plans showed and what he was seeing at the site. It was the kind of discrepancy that could easily be missed when each plan was examined separately. But when the 2 plans were placed side by side and the same section was compared, the problem became visible. Raimundo folded the plans and looked toward the southern section. The wall was already being built. 2 bricklayers stood on the scaffolding as fresh mortar was spread and the blocks continued rising. Every new row added another 19 centimeters, toward the point Raimundo had circled in his notebook. The problem was no longer simply knowing that an error existed. The problem was that construction did not wait. That day, Deborah arrived earlier than usual. She had scheduled a progress meeting with the supervisors and wanted precise numbers. How many rows of blocks were being completed each day? When would the 2nd floor be finished? Were materials arriving on schedule? The meeting took place beneath a canvas shelter. 5 men sat on buckets and wooden crates while Deborah stood before them holding a tablet. Raimundo was passing nearby with his broom when she called the general supervisor by name. "What exactly does that man do here?" she asked loudly. "Every time I see him, he's either standing still or sweeping." The supervisor hesitated. He explained that Raimundo was an experienced bricklayer and that the other workers respected him. "Experience is not a job description," Deborah replied without looking at Raimundo. "Next week, I want a productivity report for every worker. Anyone without documented results will have their contract reviewed." Raimundo continued sweeping. He did not walk faster or look away. 2 bricklayers near the meeting exchanged the kind of silent glance that expressed what neither of them wanted to say aloud. Gilbert, a young assistant in his 20s, waited until Deborah had walked away before approaching Raimundo. "Mr. Raimundo, is she trying to fire you?" "I know," Raimundo answered without stopping. "And you're not going to say anything?" Raimundo stopped and looked at the young man. His calm expression did not reveal resignation. It was something else. "Gilbert, have you ever seen a wall collapse before it was finished?" The young man frowned. "No, exactly. It collapses when it is finished, not before." Gilbert watched as Raimundo resumed sweeping. He did not understand the answer, but he sensed that it contained something he was not yet experienced enough to grasp. That afternoon, Deborah inspected the southern section with the laser-level technician. It was a routine inspection to check the vertical alignment of the walls and ensure that the blocks were being laid within the project's tolerances. The technician aimed the equipment at the 2nd floor wall, read the measurements, and confirmed that everything was within the required standard. Deborah recorded the result and moved on. The laser level measured vertical alignment, but it did not measure the relationship between that wall and what was supposed to pass through it 3 floors above. It could not identify the exact point where the plumbing plan and the structural plan contradicted each other. Each design team had reviewed its own work, but no one had compared both plans in that specific section. No piece of equipment could detect that kind of mistake. It required the eyes of someone who had seen it happen before. Raimundo had learned that lesson the hardest way possible on a project in Cascavel, 23 years earlier. The error had been costly, and he had never forgotten it. That night, he opened his notebook again. The discrepancy was still there, but now he had another important piece of information. The afternoon inspection had confirmed that the wall was being built exactly according to the plans. The problem was not the execution, the problem was the design. That made the situation far more serious. Raimundo considered his options. He could speak to the supervisor, but the supervisor would take the matter to Deborah, and she had already made her opinion of a bricklayer's suggestions perfectly clear, or he could go directly to her. He decided to try anyway because it was the right thing to do. If she refused to listen, at least there would be a record that he had warned her. The following day, Raimundo waited for the right moment. He did not approach Deborah in front of the team or during a meeting. He waited until she was alone between inspections. He walked toward her calmly, holding his notebook and carrying the 2 folded plans beneath his arm. "Engineer Deborah, may I show you something?" She looked up from her laptop, glanced at his notebook and then at the plans. "You have 2 minutes." Raimundo placed the plans side by side and pointed to the section in question. He explained the issue in simple words without accusation or drama. He showed her how the 2 plans revealed a conflict when compared, even though the problem was not visible when they were viewed separately. Deborah listened until he finished. Then she turned her laptop toward him. "Look here, this project was reviewed 3 times by a team in São Paulo. Everything has been approved. You're confusing the layout plan with the construction plan." Raimundo looked at the screen and then at his notebook. He said nothing else. "You can return to your work," she added, already looking back at her laptop. The old man slowly folded the plans, placed the notebook in his pocket and walked away. Before leaving, however, he looked at the southern wall one more time. It was still rising, and every new row brought it closer to a problem only he had noticed. Raimundo did not sleep well that night, not because of anxiety, but because he was calculating. He lay in the darkness and reviewed the measurements in his mind. If the southern wall reached the height specified in the structural plan, it would occupy the exact space reserved for the 3rd floor's sewage shaft. The shaft was the opening through which the pipes needed to pass. Without the shaft, there would be no space for the pipes. Without the pipes, the 3rd floor would have no sewage system. It was that simple. But a problem that was simple to understand would not be simple to repair. Once the wall was complete, correcting the mistake would mean demolishing part of it, rerouting the pipes, rebuilding the masonry, delaying construction and wasting materials and labor. Someone would eventually have to explain the additional cost. Raimundo already knew approximately how expensive it would be. At least 40,000, possibly much more, depending on how far construction had progressed when the error was finally discovered. The next morning, Raimundo arrived before everyone else and went directly to the southern section. The wall had gained 4 additional rows since the last time he had inspected it. At that pace, it would reach the critical height in less than a week. After that, correcting the mistake would cost twice as much. Raimundo stood in front of the wall for a long time. Gilbert arrived shortly afterward, pushing a wheelbarrow filled with mortar. "Mr. Raimundo, is everything all right? Count how many rows are left before that wall is finished," Raimundo said without taking his eyes off it. Gilbert looked up and counted. 6 or 7, perhaps. "How many days of work is that for this team?" 2 days. 3 at most. Raimundo nodded. He had tried to speak with Deborah, but she had closed the door. Trying again would produce the same result. The more he insisted, the more she would interpret his concern as the arrogance of a man who did not understand his place. There was another option. The general supervisor, Mr. Marcus, was experienced. He did not understand every detail of the plans, but he understood construction. If Raimundo could explain the problem in a way that made sense to someone who worked on the ground, perhaps Marcus could stop the work for a day or 2. That would be enough time for someone with greater authority to examine the issue. Raimundo waited until lunchtime, when the site became quieter. He found Marcus alone near the tool container and opened the 2 plans on top of a wooden crate. Then he placed his notebook beside them and pointed to the exact location of the conflict. Marcus listened, studied the plans and scratched his head. "Raimundo, I don't understand much about plans, but you're saying that this opening, which needs to remain clear for the pipes, will be blocked by this wall?" "Exactly. And the engineer said everything is correct?" Raimundo nodded. Marcus remained silent for a moment. Then he looked down at the plans. "I can't stop construction based only on your word against hers. You know that. I know, but I can do something, Marcus continued. I can call the owner. He visits once a month, but when there's a problem at one of his sites, he answers. Raimundo looked at him. Do it. Marcus. The supervisor folded the plans, returned them to Raimundo, and went to get his phone. Raimundo returned to the southern section. The workers had finished lunch and resumed their tasks. 2 bricklayers were laying blocks, 1 assistant mixed mortar, and another supplied materials to the scaffolding. The wall was rising at the correct pace and with perfect precision. The workers were following the plans exactly. That was the problem. They were doing everything correctly in the wrong way. Deborah arrived at the end of the afternoon for another inspection. As she passed the southern section, she stopped, examined the wall, and wrote something on her clipboard. This section is on schedule, she told the technician beside her. If they maintain this pace, they'll finish ahead of schedule. The technician agreed. Raimundo stood less than 10 meters away and heard every word. Deborah accidentally turned toward him. Their eyes met for a second, but neither of them spoke. That night, Marcus called Raimundo. I spoke with the owner. He'll come tomorrow morning. Raimundo remained silent for a moment. Marcus, how long before that wall is finished? There was a pause on the other end. At today's pace. Tomorrow afternoon. Raimundo ended the call and stared at the ceiling. The owner would arrive in the morning. The wall would be finished in the afternoon. It would be close. At 7:40, the following morning, Alberto entered the construction site without warning. He did not arrive in a company vehicle, and no one walked ahead of him to clear the way. He drove an old pickup truck, parked on the street, and entered the same way any worker would, with firm steps, looking both down and up, reading the site before speaking to anyone. Alberto was 68 years old. He had built his first house with his own hands at the age of 16 in a small town in Paraná. Almeida Construction now employed 43 permanent workers and operated projects in 4 municipalities. Even so, Alberto continued to visit every construction site personally once a month, always without warning. He often said that advance notice changed what people allowed you to see. He did not want to see the site they had prepared for him. He wanted to see the real construction site. Marcus noticed him entering and immediately approached. They spoke briefly in low voices before Marcus pointed toward the southern section. Alberto nodded. Raimundo was standing in front of the wall, holding his notebook with the 2 folded plans beneath his arm. When Alberto approached, the 2 men shook hands. Their handshake lasted 1 second longer than an ordinary greeting. It was not a formality. It was the greeting of 2 men who had known each other long enough to need no introduction. Show me, Alberto said. Raimundo opened the plans on top of a crate and placed his notebook beside them. Calmly and precisely, he explained the same problem he had shown Deborah 2 days earlier. This time, no one gave him only 2 minutes. Alberto listened without interrupting. He asked short questions, not to challenge Raimundo but to understand every detail. Where exactly was the conflict? What was the critical height? How much of the wall had already been built? How much time remained? Raimundo answered without hesitation. Gilbert stood approximately 15 meters away, pretending to organize materials while listening to every word. He was watching 2 men discuss the project with a kind of seriousness he rarely saw. It was not the seriousness of meetings, tablets, and reports. It was the seriousness of people who understood that the issue before them would have real consequences. That was when Deborah arrived. She entered at her usual time, carrying her laptop and clipboard. She noticed the group standing near the southern section and approached. Good morning. Can I help you? Alberto turned toward her and looked at her carefully. His attention was neither friendly nor hostile. It was simply complete. Who are you? Deborah, the engineer responsible for the project's execution. I was hired by Almeida Construction. By Almeida? He repeated slowly. She waited for him to introduce himself, but he did not. And you are? I'm the person who asked for these plans to remain open on this crate, he said, turning back toward the southern section. Are you familiar with this part of the project? Deborah recognized the issue immediately. It was the same concern Raimundo had raised 2 days earlier. Yes, she replied firmly. It has already been analyzed. The project was reviewed 3 times by a specialized team. There is no conflict between the plans. Did you overlay them? There was a brief pause. The project was reviewed in all its disciplines. The overlay, Alberto repeated calmly. These two plans in this exact section. Did you place them side by side and compare them? Deborah opened her mouth and then closed it. The truth was that she had not. Each team had reviewed its own discipline separately. It was standard procedure, but standard procedure was not always sufficient. Alberto turned toward the site's technical manager, who had arrived without anyone noticing. Bring the two plans for the southern section of the second floor. Overlay them here now. The technical manager went to retrieve them. Deborah remained still. She was beginning to understand that the older man was giving orders with an authority that no one questioned. Who exactly am I speaking to? She asked again, this time with less confidence. Alberto looked at her, the owner of the company. The silence that followed lasted only 3 seconds, but it seemed much longer. Deborah looked at Raimundo. He did not look back. His eyes were fixed on the southern wall, which had gained another 2 rows that morning. The technical manager returned with the plans. Alberto opened them on the crate, placed them side by side, and asked him to locate the intersection between the plumbing shaft and the structural masonry. The technical manager traced the lines with his finger, comparing one plan with the other. Then he stopped. He looked again and stopped a second time. Finally, he looked up at Alberto without saying anything. Then he looked at Deborah and lowered his eyes. There is a conflict, he said quietly. If the wall rises another 20 centimeters, it will block the third-floor sewage shaft. The rest of the construction site did not stop. Machines continued running and workers kept laying blocks in other sections. But around that wooden crate, everything became still. Deborah stood with her clipboard in her hand, staring at the open plans. Her name was on the contract as the engineer responsible for the project's execution. She had listened to Raimundo 2 days earlier and dismissed him after 2 minutes. Alberto did not shout. He was not a man who needed to raise his voice. Stop construction in the southern section immediately, he ordered. Not one more row until this is corrected on paper. Then he looked at Deborah. We need to talk. The conversation took place inside the temporary site office. Alberto, Deborah, the field technical manager, and Marcus were present. Alberto asked Marcus to remain not only as the supervisor but as a witness to everything that had happened. Raimundo was not invited. Inside, he sat on a concrete block near the southern section with his notebook resting on his lap. Gilbert stayed nearby without saying anything. At that moment, being present was the only useful thing he knew how to do. Inside the office, Alberto placed both plans on the table and asked the technical manager to repeat the analysis from the beginning. It took approximately 12 minutes. Then the technical manager reached the point where there was no longer any way to soften the truth. The conflict is real, he confirmed. If the wall is built according to the structural plan, it blocks the shaft indicated on the plumbing plan. Both plans were approved separately. No one compared the information at this specific point. Alberto studied the plans. How much would it cost to correct this if the wall were already finished? The technical manager calculated aloud. They would need to demolish part of the second-floor masonry, reposition the shaft, rebuild the wall, adjust the third-floor pipes, and accept a delay of at least 12 working days. The cost? Alberto asked. Between $40,000 and $50,000, excluding the losses caused by the delay. Alberto nodded once and turned toward Deborah. She stood on the other side of the table, still holding her clipboard. Do you have anything to say? He asked. Deborah took a deep breath. The mistake originated in the design. The São Paulo team approved each discipline separately. The review process was followed according to the contract. The process was followed, Alberto repeated. Yet a worker who has been here for 3 weeks saw what that process failed to see. She did not respond. Did you listen when he warned you? After a pause, Deborah answered, I listened. I evaluated his concern and concluded that it had no technical basis. Did you compare the plans while he was there? Silence. Did you or did you not? I did not, she admitted quietly. Alberto remained silent for a moment. When he finally spoke, he used the tone of someone who had built a company from nothing and had learned that heavy words spoken quietly could reach deeper than shouting. You trusted the paperwork and ignored the man who knows how to read a wall. That is the summary. Deborah had no answer because it was not merely an accusation. It was a description of what had happened. Marcus lowered his eyes. He recognized that he too had hesitated when Raimundo first approached him. Calling the owner had been the right decision, but he had waited an entire day. Alberto closed the plans and turned toward the technical manager. Contact the design team today. I want the correction completed by tomorrow morning. Work in the southern section will resume only after I see the corrected and signed plan. The technical manager noted the instruction and left. Alberto looked at Deborah. One final time. Your contract runs until the end of the month. I will honor it, but it will not be renewed. She nodded. There was nothing else to say. Deborah left the office carrying her clipboard. She crossed the site with the same firm steps as always, but something around her had changed. The workers did not stop or openly stare at her. Yet there was a different kind of silence on the site. The silence of people who had heard enough. Gilbert watched her pass and then looked at Raimundo. The southern wall had stopped rising. The two bricklayers had climbed down from the scaffolding. As soon as Marcus gave the order, the scaffolding was empty. The wall remained at exactly the same height it had been when Alberto arrived. It stopped, Gilbert said, more to himself than to Raimundo. It stopped, the old man confirmed. How did you know there would still be enough time? Raimundo opened his notebook and found the 4 words he had written on the first night, while calculating whether there was enough time to act. He showed them to Gilbert. The owner must know. Gilbert read the words and remained silent. When you can't solve something alone, you don't give up, Raimundo explained. You move one level higher. There is always someone with enough authority to hear what needs to be heard. Your job is to reach that person before the wall is finished. Across the construction site, Alberto emerged from the office and walked directly toward the southern section. He stood before the wall, studying the masonry and the empty scaffolding. Then he approached Raimundo. The 2 men stood side by side in silence, looking at the same wall. Good work, Alberto said. Raimundo nodded. He did not need anything more. The news spread around the site the way news always spreads on construction sites, without an announcement or formal meeting. Passed from one worker to another during lunch. Deborah's contract would not be renewed. Work in the southern section had been stopped. The plans were being corrected, and it had all started with an old bricklayer and his worn black notebook. Some details became distorted along the way. A few workers said Deborah had been fired immediately. Others claimed she had shouted inside the office. Neither story was true, but the part that mattered was accurate. The error had been found. The wall had been stopped, and the first person to notice the problem was not an engineer. During lunch, Gilbert remained unusually quiet. One question still troubled him. Alberto had arrived without warning, walked directly toward the southern section, and greeted Raimundo like an old friend. Neither man had introduced himself. They had simply continued a conversation that seemed to have begun many years earlier. After lunch, Gilbert approached Marcus. "Who is Mr. Raimundo?" he asked. "I mean, who is he really?" Marcus studied the young man for a moment. "Sit down." They sat on a wooden bench near the storage area. Raimundo and Alberto knew each other before this company existed. Marcus began. They worked together when they were young, for a contractor in the countryside. Alberto eventually left to start his own business. Raimundo stayed on construction sites because that was where he wanted to be. Gilbert listened without interrupting. When Almeida Construction began growing, Alberto offered Raimundo a partnership, not out of obligation, but because the company would never have reached this point without everything Raimundo taught him during the early years. Raimundo accepted a small share. He never wanted attention or an office. He asked for only one thing: permission to continue working on construction sites. Gilbert stared at Marcus. "He's a partner? A minority partner. He has been for more than 20 years. And he stays here sweeping the yard?" Marcus gave him a faint smile. "He isn't here to sweep the yard. He's here because this is where construction actually happens. Do you think he doesn't know how to use modern equipment? He chooses to use that old instrument because it has saved more projects than any laser level." Gilbert remained silent as the truth settled in. So when Deborah ordered him to sweep, she ordered one of the company's owners to sweep his own yard. "Yes," Marcus said calmly, "and he swept because the situation was never about his position. It was about the wall." Gilbert stared at the ground. The story was about more than titles or authority. It was about a man who knew exactly who he was, understood his own value, and recognized what was truly at stake. Raimundo had not wasted his energy responding to humiliation because he was saving that energy for what mattered. At the end of the day, Gilbert approached him near the stopped wall. "Mr. Raimundo, I found out." Raimundo did not pretend to misunderstand. "All right," he replied. "Why didn't you say anything? She humiliated you in front of everyone and you knew who you were. You could have said one word and ended everything." Raimundo studied the wall before answering. "Gilbert, if I had arrived on my first day and told everyone who I was, what would have happened?" The young man thought for a moment. "Everyone would have treated you differently." "Exactly. Then I would have seen only what people wanted to show me after learning who I was. I wouldn't have seen the construction site as it truly was." Raimundo placed a hand in his pocket and closed his fingers around the notebook. "I learned something during these 42 years. When you enter a place demanding respect because of your position, you close your eyes to what that place can teach you. I didn't come here to be respected. I came to see the work." Gilbert listened without speaking. "The problem with that wall had nothing to do with who I am," Raimundo continued. "It was about what I saw. If I had stopped construction using my position, the work would have stopped because of me, not because of the error. The mistake would still exist, hidden beneath something else." He turned toward Gilbert. "Do you understand the difference?" Gilbert did not understand everything at once, but he understood enough to know that he would think about those words for a long time. Across the site, Deborah left the temporary office carrying her bag and clipboard. She crossed the yard without looking to either side. She passed the southern section without stopping, entered her car and drove away. "Will she learn from this?" Gilbert asked. Raimundo considered the question. "That depends on her. Some people experience a mistake like this and become better professionals. Others find a way to convince themselves that it was never their fault. That is a choice each person makes alone." The corrected plans arrived at 8:30 the following morning. There were only 2 pages and 1 changed line in the design. The shaft had been moved 40 centimeters to the left, safely away from the structural wall. The correction looked simple on paper. It would have been extremely difficult and expensive if the wall had already been completed. Alberto arrived with the documents, checked them personally with the technical manager, signed them and authorized work to resume. Within 20 minutes, the scaffolding was occupied again. Fresh mortar was being spread. Blocks were being laid and the normal rhythm of the site returned. It was almost as though nothing had happened, and in the most important sense, nothing had happened. The error had been discovered before it became a real problem. Raimundo arrived at his usual time, carrying his lunch, wearing his faded cap, and keeping the notebook in his pocket. He passed the southern section and stopped. He looked at the scaffolding, the bricklayers and the wall, which was now rising in the correct place. There was no satisfaction of victory in his expression, only the quiet attention of someone confirming that the work would continue safely. He opened his notebook, wrote a short note, closed it, and returned to work. Alberto remained at the site longer than usual that day. He did not spend the time in meetings or inside the office. Instead, he walked around the construction site and spoke to workers by name. It was his way of understanding what reports could not reveal: the spirit of the site, the rhythm of the team, and the difference between the silence that appeared when everything was going well and the silence that warned that something was wrong. Near the end of the morning, he approached Raimundo. The old man was kneeling on the first floor, checking the level of a slab with his instrument from the 1990s. "How much longer are you staying on this project?" Alberto asked. "Until the second floor is finished," Raimundo replied without looking up. "After that, I'll decide." Alberto sat on a concrete block beside him. "You could have called me directly," he said. "When she refused to listen, you had my number." Raimundo finished the measurement, stood slowly, and brushed the dust from his knees. "I could have," he agreed. "But then you would have arrived as the owner, not as someone who had examined the evidence. You would have solved the problem through authority instead of proof. The team would have learned how to hide mistakes better, not how to see them more clearly. You allowed the situation to reach the limit because of that." "I allowed it to reach the right moment," Raimundo corrected calmly. "You arrived when you needed to arrive. The wall stopped when it needed to stop. The plans were corrected before the mistake became permanent." We didn't run out of time. We had time left. Alberto recognized the logic. It was the kind of thinking that had made Raimundo indispensable on every construction site where he had ever worked. It was not luck. It was a method, one without a technical name and absent from every manual, built brick by brick through 42 years of experience. Gilbert passed nearby with a wheelbarrow filled with mortar. When he saw the two men sitting together, he slowed down without realizing it. Alberto noticed him and waved him over. "You're new here, aren't you?" "This is my 3rd month," Gilbert answered. "Have you learned anything this week?" The young man glanced at Raimundo before responding. "I learned that there is a difference between knowing how to build and knowing how to see. And sometimes the person who knows how to see doesn't have the position of the person who should be seeing." Alberto studied him for a moment and then looked at Raimundo. Raimundo said nothing. He simply closed the notebook he had opened while they were speaking. "You may go," Alberto told Gilbert. "But remember what you just said. You'll need it someday." Gilbert nodded and continued walking with the wheelbarrow. The two older men remained silent for a moment. It was the silence of people who did not need to fill every second with words. People who had built enough trust to leave the air undisturbed between one sentence and the next. Eventually, Alberto stood and brushed the dust from his trousers. "Will you have lunch with me today?" "I brought my lunch. I know you brought your lunch. I asked whether you would eat with me." Raimundo gave him a small smile, the kind that appeared rarely and therefore said more than an easy smile ever could. "All right." The two men walked side by side toward the exit. As they passed the southern section, Raimundo stopped for a moment. The wall was rising according to the new design, firm, straight and at the correct pace, with the correct opening in the correct place. He looked at it without pride, using the same careful attention he always carried, checking and reading what the wall was telling him. The wall was saying that everything was right. Raimundo continued walking. Behind him, the construction site carried on, mortar, blocks, levels, and plumb lines. It was the sound of construction, the same everywhere in the world, but to someone who had spent an entire lifetime surrounded by it, that noise contained a kind of music that could not be found anywhere else. Raimundo slipped a hand into his pocket and closed his fingers around the worn black notebook. 42. Years on construction sites do not give you a diploma, an office, or a prestigious title. They do not automatically give you the kind of respect people offer after reading an impressive resume. They give you something else. They give you the eyes to see a mistake before it becomes a wall. They give you the patience to wait for the right moment. And they give you the wisdom to understand that the work is not about you. It is about what remains standing after you are gone. Wall always reveals its mistakes. The only question is whether someone notices them before. The wall is forced to reveal them the hard way. Everyone on that construction site had a job, but only one man had truly been paying attention. Mistakes do not announce when they are about to appear. They reveal themselves only to those who know where to look. If this story meant something to you, leave a like and tell us in the comments. Have you ever seen someone get ignored only to prove later that they were right?